Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador's webinar, Climate Change Impacts on Winter Tourism Business. My name is Craig Foley, and I'm the CEO of Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador. We're very pleased that you could all join us today, and we're looking forward to some great discussion. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. This is a webinar, so you're not able to use the microphone, but there is a chat window, which some of you have used. Also, we have a question and answer box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions, you can put them in there. There will be breaks throughout the presentation, natural times for us to answer some questions, and we will take your questions from that question and answer box. I want to respectfully acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as the ancestral homelands of many diverse populations of Indigenous people who have contributed to 9,000 years of history, including the Beothuk on the island of Newfoundland. Today, this province is home to diverse populations of Indigenous and other people. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit. I would now like to thank our partners for their collaboration and support on this initiative. Natural Resource Canada, Department of Environment and Climate Change, Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, and Recreation. We're very happy to have Lindsay Allen with us today. Lindsay is a climate resilience engineer with CBCL Limited and is registered as a professional engineer in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Lindsay specializes in climate change risk assessment and adaptation planning, supporting a wide variety of sectors, including municipal asset management, private industry, infrastructure design, and natural resource management, among others. Lindsay's risk assessment work involves analyzing climate change projections against design, operations, regulatory practices, and the natural environment to identify potential impacts from climate change and develop adaptation solutions. She also has extensive experience in facilitating stakeholder engagement workshops and consultation sessions to incorporate local perspective and expertise into risk assessment and adaptation planning. Climate is an extremely important issue that will have an impact on tourism operators. Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador, the provincial and federal governments, have recognized that to ensure that the industry remains sustainable in the long term, tourism businesses and organizations must be able to identify risks to their business to effectively plan for adaptation. Climate change is impacting Newfoundland and Labrador's land, ocean, and its related ecosystems. Tourism businesses that heavily rely on these ecosystems won't be able to operate in the same way over the coming years due to changes in the operating conditions of these ecosystems. Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador is doing a three-part series, this is the third, on climate change and its impact on various tourism sectors. Today's session will focus on the impact on winter tourism business, and Lindsay will inform us of some of the challenges facing this sector and the opportunities for adapting to prepare for the future. So without further ado, I pass it to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you to Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador for facilitating this work and the workshop today. So like Craig said, we've been working on a fairly large climate change project with Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador over the last year or so. Today, we're going to talk about the work we've done related to the winter tourism sector. Though this has been part of a bigger project that also looked at similar impacts and climate change projections related to the marine tourism sector and the outfitting sector as well. So before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that this project was funded by both the Department of Environment and Climate Change, the Provincial Department of Environment and Climate Change, as well as Natural Resources Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Program. So thank you to both of those partners for funding this work and making this project possible. So Craig's alluded to some of this already, but climate change projections for Newfoundland show, of course, significant changes by mid-century and beyond, and it's important to enhance our understanding of the impacts on the tourism industry and take the appropriate measures to ensure the industry remains resilient in the face of climate change. So that's really the root of this project, and why we're doing this work is to make sure that the tourism industry, no matter what sector, can remain resilient and prosperous in the face of climate change. So before we get started, I just want to point out the difference between climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation. The two terms can often be used interchangeable, but they do mean different things. So when we talk about climate change adaptation, we're talking about activities that lessen the negative impacts of climate change. So this includes actions taken before impacts are observed or after impacts have been felt. So really, in this case, we're in the case of climate adaptation, we're talking about things like infrastructure upgrades or changes in processes that kind of lessen the impacts of climate change. And when we're talking about climate change mitigation, these are actions to limit the magnitude and or rate of long-term climate change, generally involving efforts to reduce human emissions of greenhouse gases. So any sort of renewable energy projects or carbon sequestration, anything to reduce greenhouse gases. So in the context of today's presentation and the work that we've been doing with the Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador, we've been talking about climate change adaptation. So I just wanted to make that distinction before we start. So on the agenda for this presentation, I will just walk through sort of a project overview, some of the things that we were aiming to do throughout this project. I'll give a brief overview of the climate change projections that we looked at related to the winter tourism industry, as well as some of the impacts that we discussed with various stakeholders and through literature review. And then I'll talk about some of the outcomes of the project, so learning and development tools, a risk assessment tool that we developed, as well as some next steps and ongoing work related to climate change. All right, so for the project overview, really the objective of this project was to increase the awareness regarding the impacts of climate change on the tourism industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. So that was the main goal of the project, is really that education and awareness piece. And some of the outcomes to achieve that, we wanted to summarize relevant climate change projections for each of the sectors that we looked at. So in this case, the winter sector. We wanted to identify impacts to the industry sectors through research and stakeholder engagement. So we talked to various stakeholders within the winter tourism industry. And we also did some literature review to supplement what we heard from stakeholders. And then we wanted to summarize all of that into different tools for learning and knowledge development. So tools that Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador could have on hand to sort of distribute to members for education purposes. I will get into some of the climate change projections related to the winter tourism industry. These projections are sort of for mid to late century, that should say there. So really we're looking at sort of the 2070s or 2020s to 2070s time horizons. So you'll see me talk about if I'm referring to the 2030s time horizon, that's sort of the period around the 2030s decade. So anywhere from 2020 to 2030, 2040, and then I'll also refer to the 2050s time horizon, which is 2040s, 50s, and 60s, all the way up to 2070. So just to make that distinction when I mention those terms. And some of the different projections that we'll look at temperature, precipitation, seasonality, so the shifting sort of the winter season, wind and storms, as well as coastal parameters. And really just to summarize sort of climate change in Newfoundland and Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador is expected to become warmer, wetter, and stormier with climate change. So that's really the main theme of all the climate change projections and what you'll see in some of the results. All right, so first up is temperature. So when we're talking about temperature, when we look at averages, so the average daytime high, average nighttime low, we can basically expect to see an increase in all of those averages across the board. So that's in all regions of the province in all seasons, with the largest increases expected in the Labrador interior and at the higher latitudes in Labrador. So if you look on the plot on the right, you can see that sort of that dark red up in Labrador represents some of the biggest changes from the present day temperature conditions. And those increases in temperature will be seen, the biggest increases will be seen in winter. So on average, throughout Newfoundland and Southern Labrador, we can expect to see sort of an increase of about 2 degrees Celsius throughout the 2030s time horizon. So again, that's sort of present day up to the around 2040. And then an increase of around 3.5 degrees Celsius on average in that 2050s time horizon, so a little bit further out. And of course, that will vary depending whether you're on the coast or inland, but that's an average, I guess, across that region. In Northern Labrador, that'll look more like 3 degrees Celsius in the 2030s time horizon, up to 5.5 degrees Celsius later in the century. And then when we talk about deep freeze events, so these are cold extremes. So events where we'll see less than temperatures less than -10. So we can expect to see a decrease in those events again throughout all regions in the 2030s and 2050s time horizons. And the largest decreases in those types of events will be seen along coastal regions. And I just want to point out that the projections that we're talking about today are very high level, sort of representative of the province as a whole, though I will refer to more specific regions where possible. But all of this information on climate projections is available through the Provincial Climate Change Data Portal. And in addition to that, CBCL has been doing some work as part of this project specific to winter parameters, so things like snowfall amounts that I'll get into a bit later. And so all of that information will become available as well. So that'll be available so you can sort of see the different conditions for each region throughout the province. So continuing with precipitation. When we talk about average precipitation, we're expecting to see an increase in mean daily precipitation throughout most of the province by mid-century, and then nearly the entire province by late century. And again, that's across all seasons. Widespread increases expected across Newfoundland, with changes in Labrador typically being a bit smaller. So here, when we're talking about precipitation, that's just general precipitation, rainfall and snow. We'll get into snow a little bit later. But this is just to give you sort of an overall picture of precipitation in general. So then when we talk about precipitation intensity, we're looking at events like the 3-day maximum precipitation, 5-day maximum, 10-day precipitation, and the number of days with greater than 10 millimeters of precipitation. So we're going to see an increase in the mean intensity of all of those types of events, particularly in Newfoundland along the south coast, and the biggest changes in the winter months later in the century. So if you look at the graph or the plot on the right here, you can see those bigger changes are sort of more evident in those dark red colors on the south coast of Newfoundland. So what's happening there is because the atmosphere is warming because of the temperature increases that I spoke to a moment ago, the atmosphere is able to hold more water, which will of course fall as precipitation. All right, so getting into some of the snowfall parameters. So like I said, CBCL has been doing some projections for winter snowfall, or for, more winter related parameters. So things like snowfall amount, snow depth, and a few others. That work has been part of this ongoing work that we've been doing with Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador. So previously, a lot of the winter projections weren't necessarily as well, there hasn't been as much work done related to winter projections for Newfoundland. So this work has aimed to sort of fill that gap. So in terms of total winter snowfall, we can expect to see a decrease in snowfall, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anybody, but a decrease in the lower latitudes. So more in the island portion of the province and Southern Labrador. And in Newfoundland, we'll see those snowfall will reduce the most around the east coast of the province, whereas snowfall in central, western, and the northern peninsula will be, we'll see relatively smaller decreases there. And actually in Labrador, the highest reductions are projected along the southeast coast. But for sort of more the northern latitudes, Lake Melville and west and up towards the Torngat Mountains, we're actually expecting to see an increase in winter snowfall, which might be a little bit different than what some people would think. But again, what's happening there is because the atmosphere is warmer, it's able to hold more moisture, therefore more precipitation is falling, like I said before. But in the case of Northern Labrador, the temperatures will still be below zero, so that precipitation is falling as snow instead of rain. Whereas in Newfoundland, it'll fall on the island portion of the province, it'll fall more as rain. So that's total winter snowfall. When we're talking about average winter snow depth, so that's actually the snow that accumulates on the ground and becomes the total snow depth. We're expected to see a decrease in snow depth across all areas, all regions of the province. So even though there may be some more snow falling in some locations, that's not to say that all of that snow will accumulate and become part of the average snow depth. And those trends will be similar as total winter snowfall, and that will see larger decreases in Newfoundland and Southern Labrador, and then less in Northern Labrador. All right, continuing on with winter rainfall. So like I said, we'll see more precipitation falling as rain instead of snow because of those rising winter temperatures. And we'll see an increase in bigger events, so winter rain events, say with rainfall greater than 10 millimeters. And of those events, we'll also see an increase in the occurrence of days with precipitation during conditions favorable to freezing rain, so more freezing rain than we have seen before. So what's interesting about freezing rain is that Newfoundland already experiences the highest freezing rain amounts in North America. And like I said, that is projected to possibly increase, with the largest increases seen in Eastern Newfoundland. They'll see the greatest total change, so the largest freezing rain amounts, but the greatest relative change will be seen in Labrador. So they don't experience much freezing rain in Labrador right now. So we'll see a greater relative change there. So as part of the work we've been doing, like I said, we've been looking at some of these projections related to winter parameters. So on the right here, we just have sort of an infographic from some of the work that we've been doing that is representative of some of the changes we'll see in total winter rain and snow. So this is just for one region of the province, sort of the southern Newfoundland region, but you can see relative to historical or baseline rainfall amounts, we'll see an increase of up to 38% in sort of the 2030s time horizon, up to 60% in the 2050s time horizon. And then when we're talking about snow, we'll see sort of a 35% decrease in the 2030s. And then I can't see that number because my screen is blocking it, but a bigger decrease in the 2050s. So like I said, that's just for one zone in the province. All of this information, similar numbers, similar projections are done for various regions throughout the province. All right, so we also looked at a few different things related to seasonality. So sort of the shifting of the seasons, like I mentioned earlier. So in terms of snowfall timing, we can expect to see a decrease in the season length, or the length of time where we will see snow, and that's in all regions throughout the province. The largest decreases will be seen in Newfoundland and Southern Labrador. So we'll see something like 3 to 4 weeks decrease in that 2030s time horizon. So again, that extends from sort of now until 2040, up to 5 to 6 weeks in the 2050s time horizon. So again, that's from 2040 to 2070. And the smaller decreases in Labrador, so 2 to 3 weeks in the 2030s time horizon, and 4 to 5 weeks in the 2050s. So those are a decrease in the number of weeks that we will see snowfall. And of course, that will have implications for snowmaking. Several operations around the province obviously rely on snowmaking equipment to make sure their trails are suitable for different recreational activities. So when we looked at snowmaking, the sort of indice that we looked at was the first period of time with 3 consecutive days where nighttime temperatures are less than 5 degrees Celsius. So those are conditions that are sort of conducive to making snow. So we looked at the onset of that those conditions, as well as when those conditions would are likely to end at the end of the season. So when it comes to snowmaking, we'll see a reduction of about 4 to 8 weeks in the snowmaking season in Newfoundland, 3 to 5 weeks in Labrador. And again, that's throughout both the mid-century and the later century. And of course, this parameter is highly dependent on the capabilities of snowmaking equipment. So some snowmaking equipment is able to make snow in warmer temperatures, so something like -2 degrees, whereas some older equipment may only operate in temperatures like -5 or -10 degrees. So very dependent there on the type of equipment that you have. All right, so next I'll move on to wind and storms. So talking about things like hurricanes, nor'easters, those really big storm events. Of course, these events are often seen in more in the summer, fall, that type of season when winter tourism operators aren't necessarily operating, but that's not to say that these type of events wouldn't have an impact on your businesses. You could see things like infrastructure damage or damage to trails, all of which would have to be addressed, whether it was sort of the operating season or not. So we will see a possible increase in the intensity of tropical storms and extratropical storms, so hurricanes, nor'easters, and that will be primarily evident through increased precipitation during those events. So of course, those events already bring a lot of rainfall with them, expected to bring more rainfall in the future, like I said, as the atmosphere warms and holds more moisture. And those events will also see a possible increase in wind speeds and storm surge that comes with wind events. And then I also have a slide here about coastal parameters. This may not be as relevant to a lot of winter tourism operators if you're not near the coast, but there are coastal trails and things like that. So potential to be impacted there by some of these coastal parameters. So when we talk about sea level rise, we are looking at increases of about 0.4 meters by mid-century up to 1 meter by late century. And that's pretty variable across the province due to some vertical land motion. So what's happening is in Labrador, the land is actually rebounding after the last ice age. So during the last ice age, the land was sort of suppressed and weighed down by that glacier that was on top. As that ice has melted and retreated, the land is rebounding or rising back up. So when we're talking about sea level rise in comparison to that, because the land is rising with sea level rise, you'll see less of a relative change there. Whereas in Newfoundland, you'll see a greater relative change. And then in terms of coastal erosion, again, the rates are highly variable across the province due to different geological conditions. So most change occurring in unconsolidated cliffs and beaches. So that's any sort of like looser materials, whereas any sort of really rocky bedrock type cliff wouldn't see quite as much coastal erosion. And the increase in coastal erosion is really due to changes in processes that drive that erosion. So wind, waves, groundwater, surface water runoff, all of those things are increasing, therefore increasing coastal erosion rates. And that is all in terms of projections. Like I said, that was a very high level summary. There's a lot more information available on the provincial data portal, as well as through some of the information that Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador will release as part of this project. But if there are any questions in the meantime on any of those projections, I can do my best to answer them.
Lindsay, just a bit of a conversation with Andre, who's talking about the more near term. Would that information also be available on the provincial website, or is it longer term projections?
So the thing with climate change projections is that you really only see those big changes when you're talking about a time horizon of say 30 years. So the projections that are available are for those larger chunks of time. So when we say near term, we are talking about sort of say now, present day, and then 30 years out, and then late century would be the 30-year period after that. So you wouldn't necessarily see projections for, say, 2 or 3 or 5 years from now. I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for when you say near term, but that's sort of how climate change projections work. For certain parameters like temperature that are a little bit better understood, have less uncertainty, and are a little more defined, there are sort of resources available through Environment Canada where you can go in and you can look at annual changes. Again, they are based on models that take those 30-year time increments into account. I don't know if that answers your question, but so yes, there are projections available for near term. It's just still based on sort of 30-year time increments.
I think that's very, very helpful in context.
All right, so I'll just briefly talk about some of the different impacts that we looked at in for this assessment. So like I said, we talked to some of the winter tourism operators throughout the province, and we did some literature review. So this is just sort of a summary of some of the impacts that were heard the loudest from that. So before we dive into those impacts, we wanted to characterize exactly the assets that we were looking at, so the assets that could be impacted. So again, we spoke to some of the operators to get a sense of the assets that they rely on for their operations. So just to give you a picture, or to sort of give you the context of the impacts, the different assets we looked at. So we looked at infrastructure, which might include trails, trail bridges, any supporting buildings, so like lodges, warm-up shacks, things like that, power and communications equipment, water and sewer equipment, or any other supporting municipal infrastructure. When we were talking about transportation, we looked at, or we considered impacts to ferries, air transportation. So that's anything that's sort of bringing tourists to the province, as well as roadways and causeways within the province. When we talked about the environment there in terms of winter tourism, we're talking about snow conditions and snowmaking capabilities, which I've alluded to a little bit already. And then the tourism experience itself, we considered an asset because, of course, that is why tourists are coming to your businesses, because of those tourism experiences or those assets. So we're talking about snowmobiling or ATVs, downhill cross-country skiing, and any other recreational types of activities. And then, of course, we also looked at impacts to health and safety. So anything related to human health, insurance requirements that might be impacted because of damages that you might incur, or emergency planning and response. So those are just some of the different assets that we characterized in order to do our impact assessment. So first up, I'll just talk about wind and storms a little bit. Again, none of this information is probably not necessarily new to a lot of you. You may have seen some of this before, but just a high-level summary on some of the things that we heard the loudest, and that informed some of the later steps of the project, so some of the tools that we developed. So when we're talking about wind and storms, things like travel delays, increased no-shows due to travel disruptions or road closures, all of that can have an impact on tourists actually being able to come to your business. Increased frequency of closures and cancellations because of wind events where it may not be suitable to operate, or more frequent operations in that inclement weather. So you may see more days where people are doing these recreational activities in windier conditions or stormier conditions than normal as those conditions intensify. And then also down trees on trails, which might require cleanup or removal after a wind event. So, that could cause some sort of health and safety impact if there were to be a big tree in the middle of a trail. So all of those things would need resources to be cleaned up. Changes in snow conditions and snow accumulation from wind gusts and storms. So, some of that snow might blow off a trail in a certain spot, making that particular location not necessarily suitable. Possible reduced snowmaking capabilities during extreme weather. So if someone was making snow during a windstorm, of course, that would, they wouldn't be distributed the way it's supposed to be, therefore making it less efficient. Reduced visibility for things like snowmobiling, snowshoeing, skiing, any of those activities, which can of course be a safety concern. Structural and static facility damages. So you may get some wind damage to your buildings, damage to roofs, building envelope components like siding or windows. Damage and down electrical and communication equipment that might impact your operations. If your lodge had to be closed because of a lack of power. And then of course, increased maintenance and repair costs to deal with any of those impacts, as well as, like I said before, you may see some increases in insurance costs based on any damages or health and safety events or anything like that that may have occurred. So next up is temperature. So like I said before, due to the increase in temperature, we'll see a decrease in season length, which of course could relate to a decrease in number of people visiting your businesses throughout the season, therefore have revenue impacts. Decrease in the amount and quality of snow. Unreliable forecasted snow amounts. Potentially smaller operating windows, decreased number of patrons. So as we start seeing those changes, some of that forecasting may be a little more unreliable. Potentially unreliable ice conditions. So that could impact trails that require crossing water bodies, and of course be a health and safety concern. Increased snow making requirements. So as temperature is increasing, we'll also need to increase the amount of snow that we're making to compensate for that. So in that case, some of the businesses may need to upgrade their equipment in order to account for those higher temperatures. As well, there would be potentially an increased need for additional water consumption for snowmaking. So that can have impacts on operating costs and energy usage. And then possible damage to equipment. So skis, snowboards, snowmobiles, if there are less than ideal snow conditions. So like I said before, if the snowpack is less than in previous years, you may be more likely to hit a rock or something like that, and therefore damage your equipment. Also a health and safety concern, of course. And just fewer suitable areas or trails that are accessible for these recreational activities, as we see decreases in amounts of snow. And then in terms of precipitation, of course, we're going to see an increase in winter melting events due to precipitation as well as temperature, and then which could lead to additional flooding. Washout, flood damage to trails or transportation routes. Like I said, we're expected to see some increases in freezing rain, so we may see some ice buildup due to those events, which can, of course, impact the quality of trails and the safety of anybody who's using trails during those times. Structural and static facility damages because of flooding or freezing rain. So you may get some undermining of your foundation because of flooding, or some structural or building envelope damage because of ice loads. Same with communications equipment. We may see some additional power outages resulting from ice loading on power lines or different electrical equipment. And then of course, increased maintenance or repair costs to account for all of those things. And again, insurance requirements because of any increased insurance requirements, because of any damages or health and safety events. So that's just a very high level look at some of the impacts that we discussed with operators and that we read in literature review. Of course, it's definitely not all encompassing, but those, like I said, those are the things that we heard the loudest, and we kind of carried forward through our assessment into some of these tools that we developed for the rest of the project. So I'll just dive into that quickly, unless Craig, there are any questions at this point.
I think we're good to go.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the different tools that we developed. So first of all, like I mentioned, we've been working on these climate change projections for winter parameters. So all of those key climate change projections have been summarized into 1 or 2 page PDF type documents that sort of make everything very concise for easy to read and easy to grasp information. And then we did some sector specific impact overviews. So similar thing in that we took some of the impacts that we saw or that we heard because of these different changing climate conditions. And we summarized all of those into 1 or 2 page PDFs, again, just for easy reference. And then we also are working on some adaptation case studies. So those, again, will be wrapped up into 1 or 2 page PDFs for sort of some examples of adaptation solutions that have been, that we've seen in the province, or hypothetical adaptation solutions. We're also working on some of those where we're looking at the cost benefit analysis of upgrading snowmaking equipment and how that can be beneficial for a business in some of those increasing temperature conditions. So like I said, all of that again will be summarized in sort of easy to read PDFs for educational purposes. And then one of the bigger pieces of this project was developing this risk assessment tool for operators. So what this is a 5-step tool that will help operators consider the specific dynamics of their business in relation to climate change in their region of the province. So this is meant for operators who want to better understand climate changes and proactively incorporate climate resilience into their operations. So like Craig said at the beginning of this presentation, I do a lot of work in risk assessment, whether it be for the natural environment or infrastructure projects or municipalities, and sort of we took all of sort of the principles of risk assessment from those types of projects and summarized everything into this 5-step tool that could be used in this instance for looking at impacts and risks to winter tourism or other tourism sectors as well. So before I dive, I'll just go into the tool a little bit into each of the 5 steps, but before I do that, I'll just give you an overview of some of the key concepts of risk assessment. So when we're talking about a risk to a particular asset, we're talking about the likelihood of occurrence. So in this case, the likelihood that a climate is changing or the likelihood of a climate event occurring, multiplied by the severity of the consequences if that event were to happen. So the consequences that a particular event could have on an asset if it were to happen. And we quantify those 2 things on this 1 to 5 scale that's here on the top right. So like I said, likelihood is the probability that an event or change will occur. So a score of 1 would represent a small change, whereas a score of 5 would represent a larger change. And then severity is the impact that the change will have on the asset, assuming that it happens. So again, a score of 1 would be a smaller impact, whereas a score of 5 would be a much larger impact, something like total loss of your asset. So if you were looking at something like, for example, a 10 millimeter rainfall event in the winter, you could assess that the impact of that particular event on your different assets, the different assets that you have that support your business, and sort of score the impact on that 1 to 5 scale. And then essentially what you get is a picture of your risk in terms of this heat map up here. So higher scores are, of course, mean higher risk, which mean they are typically a higher priority for adaptation. And so that can support really the purpose of the risk assessment tools to support adaptation planning. So I'll just dive into each of the steps a little bit. This is by no means meant to be a tutorial on the tool itself, but just a high-level overview of what's available and how it can be used. So step 1 is just the background data collection step. So basically the overall purpose of this step is to create an inventory of all the assets that are key to your operations. So assets can be physical things like infrastructure, or they could also be non-physical things like your operating plans or the actual tourist attraction itself. So snow conditions, while, for example, that's not necessarily an asset that your business would own, but it is, of course, an asset to your operations. So really what the tool does here is just explains how to come up with your asset list and how to characterize each of those assets in the context of a risk assessment. So things like the age, construction materials, functionality, historical impacts to those assets, thresholds for operating. So for example, you may not be able to operate your chairlift in wind speeds greater than 60 kilometers per hour, say. All of those things can be used to characterize your assets for the context of this type of assessment. And then what we do is we summarize all of that information, so the assets and the climate parameters of interest, into what we call a risk assessment matrix. So that's what's shown here on the right. So you would list your assets sort of down this left-hand orange column of a risk assessment matrix. And I'll get into the climate part on the next slides. So step 2 is to identify climate asset interactions. So in order to use this tool, you don't need any sort of background on climate change. The tool has climate change projections within it. So there is a list of relevant climate parameters for each sector. So in this case, for the winter sector, we have 5 climate parameters included. So these parameters would go across the top of the risk assessment matrix, like you can see here in the blue. And then the different time horizons that we looked at. Like I mentioned before, we look at various time horizons. So baseline time horizon, mid-century, and late century. And so what you do in this step is essentially you look at each climate asset interaction. So in this case, each of the white boxes, and determine whether or not that particular climate parameter could have an impact on your asset. So this is just an example, but you know, you may say, okay, temperature, it could have an impact on my slopes or my trails, but it might not have an impact on my chairlift. So you could sort of tick off that box where there is an interaction, and any of those interactions move forward in the risk assessment, whereas anything that was identified to not have an interaction is therefore considered to have no risk, and therefore doesn't move forward in the risk assessment. And when we're talking about climate asset interactions, impacts can be either physical, operational, financial. They can be sort of characterized in a bunch of different ways. So we're not only talking about physical damages. It can be a number of different categories. So step 3 is actual climate change characterization. So that's the likelihood scoring piece of the risk assessment, like I mentioned earlier. So like I said, climate projections have been provided for 5 key parameters in each industry. So what we've done is we've created these maps, sort of like you can see here on the right. This one is just for extreme winds in the 2050s and then the 2100s time horizon. So what you can do is go into the tool and sort of grab the scores that are relevant for your particular region in the province. And you can fill that into your risk assessment matrix, and I'll show that on the next slide. But basically, like I said, you don't need any sort of prior knowledge on climate change to do this. You could just go to the tool and grab the likelihood scores using those maps and resources. And within the risk assessment matrix, you fill the likelihood scores in for each time horizon. So in these little boxes here, so in the red outline, you can see there's a different score for each time horizon. So baseline, mid-century, and late century. And again, that change in the likelihood score, so going from a 2 to a 5, for example, represents sort of a large change, whereas if something wasn't expected to change much over those time horizons, the scores would stay relatively consistent. And then step 4 is the impact assessment. So this is a severity scoring piece. So basically here the tool instructs you to identify impacts that the particular climate event might have on the asset that you're looking at. So you do this for each climate asset interaction that you've identified in previous steps. And like I said, impacts could be financial, operational, environmental, regulatory, any of those things. So basically for each interaction, you assign a severity score on that 1 to 5 scale. And the description, the tool has descriptions for each severity score. So here in this chart on the right, you can see there are different descriptions for 0 to 5, 0 being no interaction or no impact. But a 1 would be something like minor impact to your assets, minor operational impacts, whereas a 5 could be something like major damage to your asset that would require maybe a long-term closure or a high capital investment for replacement. So basically, with each climate asset interaction, again, you can select that score and fill it into your risk assessment matrix, again, down here in that red box. So there's only one severity score for all time horizons. And then you multiply those two scores together to get your overall risk. So like it's shown down here on the in the red box on the right. So like I said, you multiply likelihood by severity, get your overall risk, and then that each risk is representative of whether or not it's a high, medium, or low risk. The score represents that, and then you can sort of prioritize which risks are higher and which ones are higher priority for adaptation. So this is just a very small picture of what a risk assessment matrix could look like. But again, you would have scores for all of these different interactions, and that would just help you prioritize where you would need to focus adaptation planning. So basically, the overall outcome of this tool is to understand the highest priority risks, like I said, for incorporating climate change adaptation. And one of the interesting things about the tool is that it identifies timelines associated with those risks. So it sort of gives you an idea of whether or not that risk is something that should be sort of dealt with or considered in the short term or the long term. So that's the purpose of those different time horizons. And it just gives you an idea of how to begin planning for adaptation. So depending on what the risk is, there could be a number of different adaptation options that you might want to pursue or consider. Things like equipment and infrastructure upgrades, material selection. So, you know, if you have a trail that has a culvert through it, you might want to consider increasing that culvert capacity. If that became a high, if flood risk was high, something like data collection and working with research organizations to sort of improve understanding of climate processes and impacts on those assets that we talked about, or just diversification of services. All of those things are just examples of different adaptation options. And that's basically it in terms of the work that we're going to present here today. Like I said, we do have another couple of pieces ongoing. So we're doing these cost benefit analysis to support adaptation planning. So like I said before, we're looking at the cost benefit analysis of upgrading snowmaking equipment and how that can translate to sort of revenue increases and things like that for businesses. So all of that will be sort of rolling out in the near future, and as well the regional projections for winter parameters that I mentioned before. We're wrapping those up as well, and they will all be, I've given sort of pieces of them throughout this presentation, but they'll be wrapped up into sort of nice infographic style. I have a couple of examples here. Infographic style PDF documents where you can see all of this climate information summarized for your particular region. So, and there are a couple different versions of that. There's this sort of high level summary that's really easy to read and simple to understand. And then there's this version that's a little more in-depth into the science. And these will have not only projections, but in some of the orange boxes here, you can see there are different operational impacts or other impacts related to those climate projections. So like I said, all of that is wrapping up now in the near future, and Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador will be rolling all of that out for everyone's access and information. And that is pretty much everything. I don't know if there are any more questions. Craig?
I'm not seeing any right now, Lindsay, but we'll just make a call and see if anybody has anything they want to ask. And we'll watch it closely. I am not seeing anything. So I think we've probably imparted all of our information. I mean, there's an awful lot of follow-up information, and this was very high level. So I'm sure people will be very keen to see some of those PDFs and the more digestible pieces of information. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for the great presentation. And indeed, this information is valuable as we move forward in our planning for the future of tourism. This concludes our three-part series on the impacts of climate change on tourism operators. We will be sure to help to keep you up to date on any new webinars or information sessions that are important. Again, thank you to our partners for their collaboration and support: Natural Resource Canada, Department of Environment and Climate Change, Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts and Recreation. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.